Story 1. I don't think so. We have thankfully noticed that one has a slight elf ear, so they are stuck with their names now. They also have polar opposite personalities, which makes waking hours easy. One of them is possessed by a particularly loud and bouncy party parrot. I should add that our boys have nearly identical birthmarks, which felt very unfair at the start. Story 2. My boyfriend is an identical twin. He told me that his parents would differentiate him from his brother by putting nail polish on one of their big toes when they were babies. One night, while bathing them, the nail polish chipped off, and in the confusion, his parents couldn't tell them apart. They just made their best guess as to who was who. So now, whenever my boyfriend's twin tries to pull the old, "I'm 2 minutes older than you" joke, my boyfriend counters with, "That's not completely confirmed." Story 3. The doctors put a sharp mark on one of our heads and told our parents to keep the mark on our heads until they figured it out. Story 4. 100%. Why? Because they did. We applied for our driver's licenses, and when we looked at our birth certificates, we realized our mom had our middle names mixed up for the first 16 years of our lives. I still struggle to remember what my middle name actually is. My brother had a leather bag monogrammed with the wrong initials when he was 29 because he couldn't keep it straight in his head either. Story 5. This happened to my sister and me. My parents were using different colored socks to keep track, but we always kicked our socks off because we ran so hot. We were young enough to share a crib, and my grandmother was watching us. When my parents came home, we were both in the crib without socks. They shrugged and said, "Well, that one is Fren and that one is Cheeses." Story 6. I dated an identical twin for a while. She was a lovely woman from a lovely family. She told me that her parents were not sure they could tell the twins apart when they were very young. They used a marker to mark her head so they knew which child was which. At a family dinner, this story was confirmed. Her mother said that since there was nothing distinguishing between the twins and they would not sleep unless they were together, she drew a heart on my ex's head. Story 7. A woman I dated in college a bit over 20 years ago was an identical twin. She said that from the day they were taken home from the hospital, her parents intentionally got them the same clothes but always in 2 different colors. Pink versus lilac was apparently common. They always made sure one only used color set A and the other color set B. This continued until the parents could reliably tell them apart, around age 3. The same woman and her sister were also annoyed that I noticed their subtle differences quickly. I could pick them out in person nearly perfectly and over the phone in most cases too. Story 8. Mine are identical, but there is always a difference in weight and height between them. Looking back on photos is hard. Story 9. It happened shortly after birth. My parents had a name for the firstborn and a name for the secondborn. My mother switched the babies so the larger secondborn got the first name, and the smaller firstborn got the second name. My father then used monogrammed pins to tell us apart. For the first 3 years, only my mother could tell us apart. I then had an accident that needed stitches on my forehead. For 2 weeks, they could tell us apart. Then my twin sibling had an accident as well. The doctor who treated us had a sense of humor. She made sure that the stitches on my twin sibling were an exact match. For many years, we had to wear the pins. Now in our 60s, only our siblings can tell us apart. Cousins and friends still struggle. Story 10. When I was working in the neonatal intensive care unit, we often put twins in the same incubator so that they could bond. These girls were identical, same weight, same size, and same respiratory aid. The bracelets came loose with their fidgeting during the night shift, and we had no way of knowing who was who. The only way to differentiate them was to do a blood test because one twin had a high hemoglobin level and the other had a low hemoglobin level. The parents were informed, we apologized, and they found it absolutely hilarious. Story 11. That was actually a concern of mine. I like to think that I managed to never mix them up. Before I ever took off their hospital identification bracelets, I wrote their initials on their right heel so I could make sure I did not get them mixed up. After their baths, I would make sure it was still visible and would touch it up if it started to fade. I did that for almost 2 years until they were old enough to say their own name clearly. Story 12. 0%, but this is because we went to the hospital with nail polish to mark them. We did not need it because twin A had a birthmark in the shape of an A. After that, we noticed a few other differences if you look. Story 13. Nearly zero. There was a significant size difference as babies for 110 grams, which is not that much, but when the smaller is less than 2 kilograms, it kind of is. The larger child was significantly jaundiced, and we kept their hospital bracelets on for about a month. Story 14. My child went to preschool with a pair of identical twins, and at first, I could not tell them apart. I asked their mother for advice. She said she never had any issues because they have completely different personalities since birth. As a hint, one has 2 moles on their arm and the other has 3. A quick glance at their arms confirmed which twin I was talking to. After a few days, I realized what she meant. One was really quiet, and the other was a chatterbox, making it easy to tell who I was talking to. Story 15. I remember reading long ago about triplets who had tiny tattooed dots on their feet at birth to differentiate them. Story 16. I asked my identical twin nieces and nephews if they were sure my sister never mixed them up and twin A was not actually twin B. They were horrified. Apparently, this would be a soul-crushing erasure of their identities. For the record, I do not think she mixed them up since one had a birthmark and the other did not. But considering she did not sleep for about a year, it is not impossible. Once they reached a few months old, their personalities were so different they did not even really look alike. Different walks, different expressions, different ways of approaching things. I could tell which was which even over the phone. Story 17. I am not a parent of twins, but I had some twins in my school who were in some of my classes. In the 5 years I was there, I could not tell them apart unless they were in my class. Story 18. One was born with dark hair and the other has a penis. Edited to add. My coworker played an April Fool's joke with daycare once, dressing his boy and girl twin babies in each other's clothes. They looked so much alike as babies that daycare only found out when it was time for a diaper change. Story 19. Friends had a set that they marked with a permanent marker for the first couple of weeks, although there were minor differences, such as one having a slightly higher birth weight and being slightly chunkier overall. However, at week 2, one was diagnosed with an issue requiring surgery. Since then, the surgery scar has been the main difference. Story 20. My sister has twins, but most of us could always tell them apart. It helped that one twin had a tiny freckle just above the corner of her lip. I was always correcting my mom, who got them mixed up for at least a couple of years. Story 21. Twin here. Our birth record and birth certificates are switched. Birth record says baby A was born at 6 pounds 5 ounces. Baby B at 6 pounds 7 ounces. Birth certificate says my sister was born first at 6 pounds 7 ounces and I second at 6 pounds 5 ounces. Story 22. Mine are fraternal and always looked quite different. I remember a baby waking up crying, me getting a baby and starting to feed him, and wondering how he was still crying, then realizing I had picked up his brother, not him. Story 23. 10%? When my identical twins were first born, it was easy because baby B had noticeably more and darker hair. They are now 7 months old, and it is difficult. Their hair has completely evened out, and they are incredibly identical in looks and personality. The only reason my percentage is so low is that baby A developed a birthmark on her right arm before their hair evened out. We have had to use that mark to check a handful of times and otherwise could have mixed them up. Story 24. I have an identical twin and a prominent port wine stain on my face that made it easy for our parents to tell us apart. But I have faced a lifelong journey of trying to find a foundation to cover it up and convince people it is not acne. Huzzah. Story 25. I have an identical twin, and I think about this every so often. My thought is that if it happened once, it could have happened several times. So it just depends on whether it happened an even number of times. Story 26. According to a friend of mine with identical twins, their doctor told them that about 15% of identical twins do not have the correct name they were given at birth, meaning they got mixed up along the way. Story 27. Very high. We do not know for sure which one was the first out. After they were pulled out by cesarean section and taken to the warmer units to be cleaned, I lost sight of them for a little while as I was comforting my wife. It does not really matter since they have been hearing the same names since the hospital. That is effectively what their name is. It does not matter what we called them when they were being pulled out. Story 28. I have identical twins. There is no chance I mixed them up. There were enough differences from birth to always know who was who. Story 29. I knew a twin girl who said that at around age 4 or 5, she and her sister decided they each wanted to be the other's name, so they switched. Their family had a hard time keeping track of who was who anyway, so when a girl insisted they were a certain name, they went with it. Also, I have never seen twins who were so identical into adulthood. She said that until their 20s, when one of them had a child, even their friends and family had a very hard time telling them apart. Story 30. My parents used name badges for me and my brother. However, my grandmother once put 2 name tags on one baby, and my mom claims she knew which baby was which, but I doubt it. It never happened again, and I have been called by my name my entire life. I doubt I would switch to my brother's name if I learned otherwise. Story 31. Despite the fact that they are technically identical, they look very different to me and always have. I am absolutely baffled that anyone even thinks they are related. At their high school graduation party, we had pictures of them out, and I could not believe the people who could not tell them apart in the pictures. Story 32. I cared for identical twins. I painted one child's big toenail with fingernail polish until I finished. Story 33. Ours were fraternal twins. They tried to switch places in kindergarten, and we had to explain, "You are not that kind of twins." Story 34. I am a twin myself, and I am pretty sure I am not me. Even now, at 25 years old, if I video call my dad in our family WhatsApp group, he will take the call. If the name does not pop up, he will ask, "Who are you?" I cannot imagine how many times he must have confused our identities when we were tiny and could not answer when he asked, "Who are you?" Story 35. Zero chance with my identical twins. One was born with a birthmark. I have only had to use the birthmark to double-check myself once. Other than that, some of their patterns, even from the womb, continue to persist. Based on this, I cannot wait to see if some of my predictions about their individual future talents, weaknesses, and hobbies will come true. Story 36. This would stress me endlessly, and I would do everything to ensure there was no chance of mixing up my children. Well-fitted anklets, toenail polish, marker on the bottom of the foot, different haircuts, whatever it takes. I ended up with all singles, though. Story 37. I have identical twins. We used the hospital identification bracelets for the first few weeks, but after that, it became pretty easy to tell them apart. Once they got older, the behavior and personality differences made it easy. They do not look anything alike to me, but to outsiders, they are identical. Teachers used to use their footwear to tell them apart and were always stressed when we got new shoes. Story 38. Luckily, my twins definitely look like sisters but are not identical, so no mix-ups. My neighbor, however, has twins whom I still cannot tell apart after 5 years of knowing them. They look very similar. Their parents have figured it out, but they could have been switched as babies, who knows? Story 39. A friend had twins a few years ago and would joke about this, then finish with the punchline. But then I remember that one has a penis and the other doesn't, so I can just look it up in their genes. The dad jokes are strong with him. Story 40. I am an identical twin, born with a large mole on my chest, so there was no way to mix us up. However, I got an ear infection, and my dad accidentally gave the medicine to my twin instead of me. He ended up with 2 crying babies, one with an earache and one with an upset stomach from the medicine. I don't blame him because he also had to manage a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old at the same time. He invented baby wrestling once we could crawl. He would place a bottle in the middle of a blanket and put us on opposite corners. We had to crawl to the center to fight for the bottle. Story 41. My twin aunts found out they were switched when they read their baby books after my grandmother's death. There is a description of a mole or something that one has but the other does not, and it is opposite to what they have in real life. At the same time, they think they were swapped in the hospital before the book was made, so maybe when they got home, they were swapped back. Story 42. As an identical twin, this is one of my biggest fears. My mother insists they could tell us apart because of a scar I had from the neonatal intensive care unit that my sister did not have. I still question if I am the other twin. Story 43. I was slightly bigger at birth and had a birthmark. While we looked very similar, there were small differences. My mom also said our cries were very different. Story 44. I think it should be acceptable and common practice to put a small tattooed freckle behind the ear of one twin. Call it an artificial birthmark and have it be used for emergency identification. For example, one twin needs medicine while the other does not, or both take medicine and you want to avoid accidental double dosing. Story 45. You should ask this over at the parenting forum for parents of multiples. They probably won't judge you for it. I have identical twins. Right when they are born, the very first thing that happens is that they get bracelets put on them that say Baby A and Baby B. Why? Because they literally don't have names yet, not legally anyway. Once the birth certificates are filed, the nurses come in and replace the bands with new ones that have their actual names on them. My kids wore those home from the hospital. They kept wearing them for several more days until we discovered a little red birthmark on one of their legs. Once we knew that Baby B has the birthmark, except with the kid's name, we cut the bracelets off. The birthmark eventually faded, but by then they could both tell you their names and would loudly voice their objections to being mixed up with each other. So we are pretty sure we have the right name with the right kid. Either that or they've been tricking us for 12 years. Story 46. Best friend definitely has mixed up twins. She had a difficult delivery and postpartum depression, and the babies were mostly cared for by family members for the first month or so. When they were approaching their first birthday, she looked closely at their early pictures and found a couple of tiny physical markers indicating that they had been mixed up, probably at about 2 to 3 weeks old. I don't think she has told many people. She felt that those who cared for them would feel bad if they knew, as if they had been neglectful, when in reality she was very grateful that they had kept her babies safe and healthy when she couldn't. Story 47. Not a twin, but I went to school with multiple sets of identical twins. There was one set of twin sisters in particular who wore the same outfit and hairstyle every single day, down to the same colored scrunchie. I know they were going to each other's classes, sharing a hilarious inside joke between them. I am still jealous to this day. Story 48. I have read about twins and other multiple babies receiving tiny tattooed dots on their feet to differentiate them. In cases of medical issues where one baby might need important medication, this would be a good way to tell them apart. Story 49. I have wondered this myself, but my parents kept our hospital bracelets on us for a while, probably months if I am not mistaken. My sister's bracelet was on her wrist, and mine was on my ankle. They could have mixed us up after those few months, though. Story 50. I actually did. We fostered a set of identical twin infant boys. When they were dropped off, the caseworker told us their names and pointed, and we went with it. Their paperwork did not include a picture for reference or anything. When she came the next time with their siblings and mother, we called them by the wrong names and were loudly corrected. Story 51. I have fraternal twins, a boy and a girl. They were often asked if they were identical. Story 52. As a mother of identical twins, this was one of my biggest fears while pregnant. Luckily, they were born 8 ounces different in weight and with a few birthmarks, so I am very confident I did not confuse them. If I did mix them up, I apologize. Hopefully, you can get therapy for the personality crisis it causes. Story 53, 0%. They received scannable ankle bands immediately after birth at the hospital. One is significantly larger than the other and has been since birth. They also have differently shaped chins. We have no trouble telling them apart. Story 54. Fortunately, 0% in my case. I was worried about it with my identical twins, but one of them went to the neonatal intensive care unit immediately after birth and was quite a bit puffier during his stay there. He also has a prominent birthmark on his arm. By the time they started to look identical a few months in, I had their quirks figured out. Now that they are taller than me and extremely identical looking, I can still tell them apart. They have little physical subtleties that are hard to explain, despite their attempts to trick me. Story 55. My husband is a twin. His mother used to get this question very often. The funny thing is, my husband has a twin sister. So she basically tells them, no, it is not hard to tell us apart. You just have to look for the difference. Story 56. Not a parent but an identical twin. I kicked her head in the womb hard enough that she had a footprint-sized mark on her head our whole lives. I helped with the identification process. Story 57. It happened to us in the hospital. The nurse switched our identification bracelets and put them on the wrong twin. When we were brought back to my parents, they were adamant that no, this twin was Bagel and that one was Bites, so the identification bracelets were swapped back. They acknowledged they could have been mistaken. At this point, it does not matter. Story 58. I have identical twins who are now 10 years old. I'm not sure who was who in the womb at that point. They may have switched positions, and I can't say with confidence which was baby A or baby B. We didn't call them by their given names before birth, so I don't suppose it really matters. But once they were born, there was zero chance I mixed them up. I was prepared with name bracelets, toenail polish, and so on, but they were almost a pound different in weight, which is easy to tell with 4 and 5 pound babies. By the time their size had evened out, I already definitively knew which was which. For me, I can tell by their eyes. One has always had a squinty right eye, while the other holds his eyes open wider all the time. The one with the squinty, I also conveniently developed a mole above his upper lip at around 18 months old, which makes for easy identification for people who don't know them well, except during COVID when masks were worn. They also have different back hairlines. One has a pronounced duck but shape like a point down the middle of 2 raised sides, and the other is more straight across. The mole and the hairline are the easiest ways for new people to tell them apart from front and back. But for me, it has always been the eyes. Story 59. We got them badly mixed up once as infants at the doctor's office, no less. But I knew their weights, so we weighed them and were able to tell. From then on, one always had nail polish on a pinky toe. Edited to add a word I missed before. Story 60. My mom said she picked a defining feature and compared it. It was ears for her, but she said she could also tell by our measurements when we were checked right after birth. My sister was slightly heavier, and I was slightly longer until we got out of the initial few weeks. She claims she could always tell us apart, but a lot of people confused them, and my dad just went with what she said at first. We apparently also nursed differently. Story 61. Not at all for mine. They are fraternal twins and each had their own placenta. By 20 weeks gestation, twin B had a giant kidney. They were named around 25 weeks. They did not move. Twin A was fully developed in my pelvis and twin B was up by my ribcage. From birth, their facial structure and personalities have been vastly different. Now at 1.5 years old, even though they have the same hair color and are the same height, their bodies are different shapes. Twin B has legs that are 2 inches longer than twin A. Their faces are different and even their voices are different. They are truly siblings who just happen to be born at the same time. Story 62. Twin here. The hospital gave us little name tags around our ankles but removed them after we left the building. Parents placed us in the car, and by the time they got home, they completely forgot which was which. Story 63. Luckily, one of our daughters had a birthmark on the top of her right foot. That helped enormously. Funny story though, when they were newborns, baby B needed some medication. I came into the bedroom one night asking my wife, "Why are you giving baby B's medicine to baby A?" "I'm not," she said. "You are." "No, I'm not," she exclaimed. "Check the foot." "Damn it, I need more sleep." Story 64. My twins were born a pound apart. I would often mix them up just one-on-one with me like I was sure I was holding baby A, but when I went to set her down next to the other twin, I could see it was actually baby B based on size. They stayed 1 pound apart for years, which was very helpful to tell them apart. Story 65. My mom is a triplet, and my grandmother decided to give them small stick-and-poke tattoos of dots on the soles of their feet, with the number of dots corresponding to their birth order. By the time the tattoos faded, they all knew their own names and had distinct personalities that allowed them to be easily told apart. Story 66. Apparently, my mom forgot to apply nail polish to someone's toe and had to send our footprints to the state to identify who was who. Story 67. It does not matter. They are like entangled photons. They both influence each other even at room temperature until you ask one of them what their name is. At that point, the system resolves into a classical state, and the other one suddenly becomes definite. Story 68. 0. They are 11 minutes apart, and the first one received his hospital bracelet before his brother was born. We kept their hospital bracelets on for a few weeks to give us time to find a more permanent way to tell them apart. While we were trying to figure out a method, one twin developed a large mole on his thigh. There has never been a chance to confuse them. Story 69. Dad of fraternal twin girls, meaning not identical. During all the pre-birth ultrasounds, we had baby A and baby B. I believe the way they were positioned made it so they did not move around too much or switch positions, so baby A was always baby A and so on. Also, they were not the same size. Baby A was always slightly bigger than baby B, and now at 15, baby A is taller than baby B. For a while, she was heavier than her too. Regardless, baby A was handed to me in the operating room while they worked on baby B. Story 70. One of my twins is like the mini version of the other. We can always tell them apart because it is like Dr. Evil and Mini-Me. The smaller one is definitely the evil genius of the two. Story 71. We don't know if my boys are identical or not. When they were babies, baby A, Steve, mostly wore green with dinosaurs, and baby B, Bob, wore blue with puppies. One day, I was holding one and realized I was holding Steve but calling him Bob. Someone else had dressed them the day before, so as I changed them, I went based on their outfits. But when the baby I was holding didn't have the little cowlick on top of his head, I realized it wasn't Bob at all. And we'd been calling them the wrong names for a little over 28 hours. I'm honestly more worried the hospital switched them because when I was pregnant, Steve had such a hard time with monitoring but is now the sweetest. Bob was great in utero but is a little troublemaker now. Story 72. My nephews are identical twins. They are 3 years old, and I can only tell them apart because one has a birthmark on his gums. However, it did not show up right away. I do not know how they could tell them apart for the first 6 months. I have always wondered if they mixed them up. Story 73. My husband and I spent a whole day noticing that person A was doing person B's activities and vice versa. It did not occur to us that we had mixed up their outfits until they insisted on switching beds that evening. Then we checked their birthmarks, so we are sure that the error did not persist. Story 74. My aunt has twins. There is 0% chance they got mixed up because one has slightly rounder cheeks than the other. When I say slightly, I mean her cheeks are like an atom's width wider than her sister's. I can't see it. Only their parents and my grandmother can. That's some sorcery. She also has an older pair of twins, a boy and a girl, so I think mixing them up is a bit harder. It doesn't help that their names are almost identical. I can only tell them apart because one always has pink hair ties and the other has yellow. Story 75. I once dated twins, but getting them mixed up was never really a problem. Susan's hair was longer and usually in a ponytail, and Colin had a mustache. Story 76. I am 7 years older than my brother and 23 years younger than my father. I have been called both of their names. Twins would not stand a chance in my family. Story 77. Older sibling to twins, one had a very distinct birthmark, so there was never a question of who was twin A versus twin B. By the time they were old enough to have the birthmark addressed, there was no question of who each was. Story 78. We were lucky. They were fraternal twins and had a couple of features different enough to keep track. Look under the little beanies. Are they blonde or redhead? Story 79. My two best friends growing up were identical twins. Only their close family and I can tell them apart in baby pictures. They even have trouble sometimes. Story 80. Although my boys look absolutely identical to everyone else, I see their differences clearly. Story 81. That's something funny. My twin and I switched our names when we were 6. I do not know how, but we have kept them until now. Story 82. I have identical twins. When they were born, there was a noticeable weight difference. After a few weeks, we noticed that one of them had stork bites on his eyelids and the other did not. It really helped. Now, they are toddlers and we can tell them apart easily. Story 83. Ours had a couple of significant differences right away that made it easy to tell when they were potatoes. One was almost a pound bigger, which is a big difference when they weigh 5 and 6 pounds. The bigger one had stork bites on her eyelids, so she always looked like she had pink eyeshadow on. By the time their weights equalized and the stork bites disappeared, we had figured out who was who based on their different head shapes. Now they have very different personalities. We were lucky and the chances were slim, but we were absolutely terrified of this exact scenario before they were born. Story 84. Babies are not born with self-awareness, and it develops as they age. They do not even recognize their own name until about 7 months. I would say whatever you consistently call them after that point is their name. Story 85. I grew up with a set of twins. The parents gave one of the children a small tattoo on the inside of her wrist. It looks like a freckle and was the only way to be sure when we were growing up. Story 86. Fraternal girls. One was born with a coloboma, a small gap in the eyelid. Coincidentally, we named her Maddie, a name chosen before they were born. They look different, but since she and her twins started daycare at the same time, I told them it was easy to remember because the one with the unusual eyelid is Maddie, like Mad Eye. Maddie is not pronounced that way, but I thought it was funny and would help them easily remember who is who. The coloboma was fixed at 4 months old. You can still kind of see it, but not much. Story 87. Neither twins nor parents, but my cousins are, though not identical. Long after they moved out, their mother passed away, and they went back to help their father clean out the attic. They found their birth certificates, but their names did not match their respective dates of birth. Turns out that at some point, their parents just started calling them by each other's names and went with it. Story 88. They had to turn us around to look at the back of our heads. My sister had a blonde streak that I did not have. It was the only way they knew who was who. Story 89. There were always sufficient differences, including head shape, to differentiate. Eventually, one individual presented as left-handed. Story 90. I have fraternal twin boys. Throughout the pregnancy, they were called Baby A and Baby B. They acted differently in the womb, I promise. When they were born, one twin was delivered first and called Baby A, followed by Baby B. I had always thought of Baby A as my son Alex and Baby B as Jack. However, we named the first baby delivered Jack. Long story short, I have no idea who was who, but they are definitely Jack and Alex now, and their names fit them perfectly. Twins are weird. Story 91. I would say 0%. When they were born, they immediately had hospital identification bands placed on, which remained until we left the hospital. While the bands were on, we wrote their initials on their feet with a marker. The marker never wore off until we were completely confident we could identify them. Story 92. A friend had twin boys. He told me he only ever had trouble telling them apart when they were running away because they were in trouble. Story 93. I am glad I am not the only one who spends so much time thinking about this, considering I have never had twins. Story 94. My twins were in the neonatal intensive care unit for 5 weeks with their little hospital anklets, which made it easy. Once we found a defining mark, an ear bump on one, it has been easy to tell them apart. I do call them the wrong name anyway, but that's just life. Story 95. 0%. We kept their hospital bracelets on until they began to get too small. Before cutting them off, we used nail polish on one of their toes until we could both reliably identify differences between them. Story 96. Contrary to popular belief, identical twins are not always completely identical. If my boys were running around like crazy when they were little, it was sometimes tough to tell who was who. However, as soon as I could get a good look at them, it was easy to distinguish between them. Story 97. 0. Although they are identical, one has a birthmark, so we could always tell them apart from day one. Talk about lucky. Story 98. I put nail polish on one of their big toes when we came home from the hospital. It was not really necessary though. One has always been slightly bigger than the other, and that held true until they were in their preteens. It is a slight difference, but I have always been able to tell them apart. Story 99. One has an innie and one has an outie, which made them fairly easy to distinguish. Hopefully, most parents of boy/girl fraternal twins would not mix them up, but half the world seems to be of below-average intelligence. Story 100. As a twin, I think about this from time to time, like maybe I am actually my twin's name, and my parents just mixed us up at some point. Story 101. One of mine has a birthmark and the other does not. This did not help strangers, as it was hidden. Preschool teachers always swapped them, and as they got older, they swapped themselves at school from time to time. Story 102. Dated a guy with much younger twin sisters who had a 16-year age gap. They were very young when we started dating. I could never tell them apart. We dated for about a decade. I was always saying, "Hey girl, who are you?" Or their favorite. Stop. Identify yourself. Story 103. Not kid-related, but still on the topic of twins and recognizing or mixing them up. I have always been able to tell the Sprouse brothers apart and thought that was unusual that I could do so with such accuracy. I have never been a huge fan or anything, but my mom watched Friends and I would occasionally watch The Sweet Life growing up. As a little kid, I could just tell when it was Cole or Dylan and never understood the show trying to play up confusing them when it was very obvious who was who. I had friends who could not tell the difference, and my mom thought they were the same person but doubled like in Parent Trap. I always assumed this must be how parents see it for their own twins, and then many comments here are like, so the sock, polish, or headband fell off. It's now 50-50. Good luck. Which is very funny to me. I wonder if the Sprouse parents ever had a moment like that when they were infants, since to be fair, I have never seen a picture of them as babies or toddlers. Story 104. 0% chance. One had hydrocephalus and a heart condition at birth. I have never and will never mix them up. Story 105. When they were born, the obstetrician put one clamp on baby A's umbilical cord and two clamps on baby B's. By the time the umbilical cords fell off, we had identified marks such as moles and ear shape. We also painted their left big toenails different colors to make identification easy. Story 106. Not likely. My daughters are identical, but at birth, there was almost a 2-pound difference. By the time they weighed the same amount, we already knew who was who. Story 107. I left my identical twins hospital bracelets on them for the first month of their lives. After that, I marked the bottoms of their little feet with different colored markers for a couple of weeks until I could tell them apart. They are 8 now, and I still have plenty of family members who claim they cannot tell the difference. Story 108. The nurse wrote left on one of the twins' feet and right on the other as soon as they were born. This was very helpful. Story 109. My nephews are twins, and I could always tell them apart because one of them had a small white birthmark under his eye. Well, fast forward and the mark is gone. I just have to focus on what they are wearing and remember which one is in which shirt. Story 110. As a father, I guess the odds are about 20% even though ours are not identical. There were several groggy nights at 2 a.m. between age 2 weeks and 4 weeks when I am not 100% certain I laid them back in the right crib after changing their diapers. Story 111. I have a boy, baby A, and a girl, baby B. In the hospital, baby B's band came loose from her leg, and the nurses came to check the boy. They thought B was for the boy. They almost put the hospital on lockdown because they needed to scan the barcode to remove the alert. After a few minutes, they finally said they needed baby B. Story 112. My twins had an almost 2-pound weight difference when they were born. It remained throughout most of their first year, so by then we were able to tell them apart in different ways. There was no confusion. Before they were born, we bought different color bracelets for them to wear. That helped as well. Story 113. I read a story about this once. On the first night at home, they ended up driving to the hospital to confirm with footprints. According to the story, they then drove to a tattoo place and got a single small dot on the bottom of one of their feet. Even if it is probably not true, I like to believe it is. Story 114. I have fraternal twins, a boy and a girl. I have always been able to tell them apart by their faces and the sounds they make. My husband, not so much. Story 115. They are only 5 months old and genetically identical, but one has a rather large birthmark. They also have differently shaped heads, but it is mostly due to the birthmark. Story 116. When we had our twins, a girl and a boy, I learned that twins can only be identical if they are the same gender. This, of course, makes sense. However, I did not know this at the time, nor did the many people who asked us about it during and after the pregnancy. Story 117. My uncle asks my twin sister and me that all the time, assuming no medical complications. At a certain point, it does not matter whether it is correct or not because you start identifying with what you are called most often. Story 118. Identical twin girls, but I would say none. One was born with a hemangioma on her torso, so we always knew which one she was. By the time it fully disappeared, we could tell them apart for sure. Now, one has a freckle on her chin, which is how everyone else tells them apart. Story 119. My father regularly confuses me and my brother. We were born 2 years apart. I do not doubt that many twins have their names swapped, but that does not mean it is the wrong name. Story 120. For me and my sister, there was no chance I would have a birthmark on my thighs and she would not. However, my parents did leave our legs bare a lot during those first months, apparently. Story 121. There was a significant size difference. The twin who was larger at birth by a little over 1 pound and 1 inch is still 1 to 1.5 inches taller at 6 years old. So there is no chance here. Story 122. Honestly, this is something I worried about all the time while I was pregnant. I was kind of freaked out that they would get mixed up when we brought them home and then they'd be the wrong twin for the rest of their lives. But in reality, there is literally zero chance that happened. They were obviously very different even though they are identical. One weighed about half more than the other, and that makes a huge difference when that is 10% of your body weight. Their heads were shaped differently. Their hair whorls were going in opposite directions. Plus, one of them had to come home on a breathing monitor, so had a bunch of wires attached for the first couple of months. So yes, absolutely zero chance. Story 123. I don't think we did because one of our twins had some minor health issues and we had to check his blood sugar levels frequently. If needed, we could just look for the marks on his feet. The medication had a side effect of excessive hair growth, so he had a full head of hair while our other son still had wispy baby hair. I had pictures taken of them at about 3 months old, and they barely looked like twins. After stopping the medication, they went back to looking identical, but there are subtle differences that allow you to tell them apart if you know them. Their eyes look slightly different, and one had a slightly rounder face. We would use color coding when around family and friends to help avoid confusion. They are 18 now and have ended up with different heights. One has an eyebrow scar, and they have different voices, personalities, and haircuts, so it is easy for most people to tell them apart. Story 124. My boys are fraternal twins, so they look like any other set of brothers, but somehow their medical files still got mixed up. When they were born, they looked more similar, but I could tell them apart just by touching their heads. Baby, it was so stretched out inside me that the top of his head could be felt when touching my side. I felt it for weeks, and if I ever go blind, I will still know my baby just by touching the top of his head. Story 125. I do not have identical twins, but a friend of mine does, and they were impossible to tell apart when they were very young. When they were born, the hospital staff used marker dots on the bottom of their feet to distinguish them. After my friend brought them home, she and her family used a dot of different colored nail polish on one of their toenails and dressed them in different colors to avoid mixing them up. Story 126. Newborn identical twins, just home from the hospital, are hanging out in diapers and a swaddling blanket. We accidentally removed their hospital bands. My husband is holding one twin, and I am holding the other. As we take them up to bed, I say, "Good night, baby A." My husband asks, "Don't I have baby A?" We remove their swaddles and lay them down. Mine looks slightly smaller, so I assume she is baby B at this point. We have never mixed them up since. However, baby B could very well actually be baby A. Story 127. One of my identical girls has been large since before birth compared to her sister, who had her umbilical cord in the worst spot. There is no chance I have ever mixed them up. I had planned to use piggy paint on their toenails, but it was never necessary. It is trickier now that they are older and the same size. Fortunately, their voices are different. I still mix them up all the time when I am distracted. I usually have them wear their hair in different styles to keep track. Story 128. Mine are fraternal. Plus, baby A was a whole pound and a half bigger at birth than baby B. So I always knew. Others could not tell right away because as babies they looked much more alike. However, if you pointed out their tiny differences like birthmarks, some people could figure it out. Story 129. Our daughter Evelyn was born with a small tuft of hair on her forehead. Our son was born with a penis. We have successfully used these slight differences to distinguish between them. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.